Hello everyone. Yes, slight change of scenery here for this video. Thought I'd try something different since it is a slightly different topic than my typical album review. I promised that I would make this video when I filmed the precursor video for this, which was a kind of hopes and fears video, me explaining sort of the prelude, the impetus for this Amazon Prime series, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. The full season of 8 episodes has now completed airing. The last episode came out on October 14th. And I'm a little late with this video. Please forgive me. I wanted to get this out sooner, but I knew I needed to make sure I watched each episode at least twice before I filmed this review. And I wanted to, of course, let this digest a little bit. But I will link in the description the video. You don't have to watch it to watch this one, but I do like a really long deep dive, like an hour and a half, basically, of my sort of fears and hopes and expectations for this show based on, all of the marketing that came out ahead of time, the paper trail of, producers and writers that were attached to the project, and the 4 to 5 years it took for it to come to fruition. And, I was honest in my, fears and hopes in that video. And of course, I'm going to reiterate that again in this one. This show is getting a lot of crap from fans online. Critics are being honestly surprisingly kind to it. But, the actual fans, the Tolkien fans, the ones who are the most of the people who are actually watching this, especially more than just the first 2 episodes when it premiered, they're the ones that have, for the most part, really bad things to say about this show. And look, I am not here to just blindly bash. I want to make that very clear that this is going to be an honest and I think balanced review of the series because truthfully, and this is kind of what I expected going in, this series was pretty much the mixed bag I expected it would be. Meaning there was a lot of garbage in it. There was a lot of stuff to sift through that I didn't agree with because I'm a Tolkien fan. I've read the books. I'm a little iffy on some of my hardcore Tolkien lore, especially Second Age stuff, because I got to be honest with you, the Second Age, I didn't really, there's not as much material to read on for starters. And also, I didn't find the Second Age as interesting as the First Age, which is something I would love to see adapted into a film or TV series at some point. But if Christopher Tolkien's, spirit haunting the Tolkien estate has anything to say about that, we're not going to be seeing anything like that for a very long time. And unfortunately, with Amazon and the show, they're kind of giving Christopher Tolkien and the others who doubted that Tolkien's works should ever be sold and rights should ever be sold to any media companies, they're getting the last laugh here, which is so, as a fan of the Peter Jackson films, so painful. I'll get into it. But again, I don't want to reharp on too many things I said on that first video. So if you're interested in my thoughts on, sort of the more overarching idea of this series and what I hoped they were going to do with it and the build up to it and the sort of the history of it, I talk more about that. And of course, my first reactions to some of the cast announcements and all of that kind of stuff. This video is going to be a little bit more meat and potatoes. I'm really just going to be talking about these 8 episodes. I'm not going to go into extensive detail on every single episode. I'm more just going to be pinpointing certain things I liked or didn't like from certain topics of this or themes that I'm going to go through. And like I said, it's going to be a mixed bag because as much as there were things I did not like, there were also things that I did. And I do want to give them their dues because I feel like it's a little unfair how much this show is being derided when there are some spectacular things about it. But they're kind of all relegated to certain categories because some categories in the production of the show were done okay to really well. And then a lot of the other categories were pretty much across the board pretty bad. You probably get an idea where I'm going with this. So without too much further ado, we had the first episodes. They aired together on September 2nd. And, again, to provide a brief synopsis of this series, for example, this is going to be a spoiler review just in case none of you have seen the show. Even if you've read The Lord of the Rings, if you've read the appendices, if you've read the Silmarillion, the Akbeleth, which is the part about the Second Age and the fall of Numenor, if you've read Unfinished Tales, you're still not really going to know what's happening in the show. It's going to feel like an entirely new thing, which I guess for entertainment value, if you want to have surprises that you don't see coming, maybe is a good thing. I'm trying to be positive here. But, for someone who thinks they know what the show is going to be about because they know the lore, this first season, you're not gonna, all your predictions are gonna be completely off because the show is so far, so far removed from where the lore is kind of wanting it to go. And keep in mind, this show is meant to be 5 seasons. There's definitely gonna at least be a second season. They've already started filming for it. So we're in for a long haul here. It's also probably going to be about 2 years before we get the second season, considering how much money and effort goes into producing this kind of thing. But be that as it may, a brief synopsis of, the first episode, and sort of my thoughts on it, Shadow of the Past. Look, I was obviously very hyped for an idea of a prologue, just like they do so wonderfully in the Peter Jackson films, a prologue to in this case, what would be the first age of Middle Earth, but even before the first age, what's called the Ainulindale. I don't think I pronounced that right, but it's basically the creation story, the Genesis book of the Bible or the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion kind of is my Bible, so I talked about that in that first video I made. There are a lot of parallels biblically, even though Tolkien liked to say it wasn't right allegorically. We all, and I must admit, there were certain names and certain canon things or semi-canon things that I must admit I was a little surprised to see included in the show. They mention Ole the Valar, who is the one who created the dwarves multiple times, though I suppose, again, if anything is in the appendices, it's fair game for them to use. And I do feel like perhaps the Tolkien estate was piecemealing them certain little bits of lore to throw in here and there. Because there are certain things in the history that, and I'm a little rusty with the Second Age, again, forgive me, that might not have been in the appendices, or they just made up, or they conveniently would say, like, for example, there's a scene where Arondir is talking to Bronwyn, this elf, is talking to a human and talking about the Valar of basically all things that grow, so of plants, of trees. Her name is Yavanna in the lore. But they basically can't say that name in the series. So they just refer to the goddess of plants or something along those lines. And it's like, yeah, they don't have the rights to say the name, but they do have the rights to say of it. Or they can sort of fill in the blanks without specifically stating a specific name that Tolkien mentions in the Silmarillion. Okay, so the prologue story is narrated by Galadriel, who is played by Morgoth Clark. And just like in the original, makes sense. She's the oldest person in this drama that is still on Middle Earth. Compared to the Gil-galads or the Elrons, she would basically be like, in human terms, their great-grandmother. Like, by the age generation gap, she's thousands and thousands of years older than them. Yet, ironically, she's treated as though she's sort of this unruly young sprite who's not fully she's not fully matured into her training as an army captain and, in the royal ranks of the Noldor in Lindon. She's treated very much like a novice. And personally, I just don't understand how she has authority almost over all of them. I mean, yes, she was not the High Queen at the time of Lindon. That is canonically correct. It was Gil-galad. But Gil-galad was not born in the Year of the Trees. So, the Year of the Trees is referred to in the prologue sequence, where we actually do see the kingdom of Valinor. And I, of course, ever since I read the Silmarillion, have been giddy to see Valinor represented in film. It's always been something that I almost feel like might be a little difficult because it's supposed to be Eden, the Garden of Eden. It's supposed to be paradise. And how do you make that look whimsical and magical without also looking really cheesy and Disney? Because it's supposed to be different from Middle Earth. And honestly, to be fair, what they showed us, I was pretty happy with. And that sort of goes into the whole line of, if we're talking about visuals on this show, that might be my highest score for the whole thing. The visuals, the settings, the vistas, the cinematography, for the most part, I was absolutely blown away with. The lighting, the show is very well lit, the color saturations, the costumes, I think, are exquisitely detailed. Sometimes it does feel like a set, but that's something we had in the in the Peter Jackson films as well. it's kind of inescapable when you're making a fantasy like this. I was actually happy with how many live locations I felt like were being used. Obviously, there were CGI animated forests and backdrops, but it wasn't as egregious as, let's say, the Hobbit films were. I did feel like even if it was a CGI background, it looked a lot more real, like a lot more effort and time was put into making it look so luminous and real rather than being very oversaturated and very CGI, very video game. And I was just ultimately very impressed. I would love to see a 4K mastering of just the visuals of this show. If there is any reason why I'm going to splurge on the Blu-ray or the 4K of this production, which is something I've happily done for the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films, because I'm that kind of Tolkien fan, I would do it for the visuals, because the cinematography is just, honestly, it's exquisite. Some of the shots. Anyway, so we get a little bit of a glimpse of the Kingdom of Valinor, the high city that I believe is supposed to be Tirion. We see that shot of. We have Finrod, who is Galadriel's older brother. So basically Galadriel is, I really should stop because I'm going to just be recapping every single scene. But I want to talk a lot about the prologue because the prologue is important. So Galadriel is sort of shown as being bullied by the other elven children, which, okay, that's a bit of a liberty there. We don't exactly know a lot about Galadriel's early days in Valinor, so I guess that's fair game. There's this metaphor about her wanting to create a ship, and this adventurous spirit that the other children don't seem to have is very evident in her. And there's this whole metaphorical kind of pep talk that's given to her by Finrod about chasing your dreams is important, but it's also important to look at where you're coming from, where you're going, what you're above, and what's above you, like keeping a full perspective of your surroundings so that you just don't blindly go off into the distance without thinking. An apt little kind of familial moment. It sort of adds a little bit of emotion to Galadriel's character to show that. And I think that's important because the Galadriel we get in the show is very devoid of kind of personality, let's just say, besides vengeance, which is obviously the name of the game. But then we get the whole sort of rushed kind of talk about the first stage, the battle with Morgoth. It is obviously brushed over very quickly. And to be fair, I mean, what can they do? They don't have the rights to the Silmarillion. They don't have the rights to most of it. And they also only have so much time. If we're talking about the average person, like my mom, for example, who's watching this with me, who does not know anything about the first stage, did they do a good job at explaining it for someone? I don't think so. My mom was hella confused after the first episode, particularly the first episode, because the first episode is very exposition heavy, particularly in the first act. And if you're not really familiar with how Valinor is a separate continent, not part of Middle-earth, and how Numenor is in between them, and more importantly, if you don't understand that in that time that Valinor and Galadriel is very young in, there is no sun and there is no moon, that line that Galadriel says where this was a time before the very first sunrise, you'd be scratching your head because doesn't it look like the sun's in the sky? Like what? They don't explain very well besides just showing the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion. They show the two trees, which is cool. I mean, they kind of rush through it, but whatever. But they don't explain what the two trees are. They don't explain how they used to be a substitute for the sun and the moon, before the sun and the moon existed, before the two trees were destroyed by Morgoth the first time, when Morgoth does desecrate Valinor, and that is accurate in the lore, and they do show that. And so it's just these little things that I do feel like they spend so much time on these other moments in the show. I'm going to get to it where it's just like, this is too much. We're moving too slowly through the story, where the big moments, the canonical moments that you could focus more on, you skip over so quickly. And that's a real problem in the first episode of this series and in the last episode. And those two are probably the lore, the most heavy with the lore. The middle stuff is... it's doing its own thing. It's using place names and settings, and that's about it, with a couple rare references to, like I said, some gods of the elves and some elven kings in here and there. But it's very dubious. So the prologue, of course, shows Finrod dying in battle, and of course illustrates that Galadriel is going to hunt Sauron till the day she dies to avenge mostly her brother. Now, keep in mind, Galadriel has multiple brothers, okay? Galadriel is from like a family of 5, if I'm not mistaken. But they don't mention any of the others because I guess they're not mentioned in the appendix. Forgive me, I've not read the appendices since I was like 12 years old. So I don't remember what's in them. I only know the more expanded versions. But Galadriel has a lot of elven princely brothers. So, a lot of them die. I think all of them die, if I'm not mistaken. So she's the last one living by this point. So she's got it rough. Of course, we don't mention any of the other brothers of hers. Their names will be down in the bottom, which is, fine. That's whatever. I can understand. I mean, they don't want to get too far into lore that's not necessary. Maybe it's not necessary for the Second Age that we know about her other brothers, but anyway, or that much about her father and all of that, and how she's connected to Feanor. We do mention Feanor several times. Celebrimbor mentions Feanor in the Silmarils, which, again, if you're unfamiliar with the lore, going to go right over your head. They do not do a good job explaining the Silmaril stuff. And then, of course, there's some dubious kind of left field lore stuff that they introduced with Mithril and the Silmarils, which is not at all canon. So we'll get to that. The prologue, I don't know. I like the Valinor scene, but the rest of the prologue was definitely haphazardly constructed. There's some great shots. But it could have been explained and sequentially done a much, much stronger. And then we have the overarching story. So, Galadriel is hunting Sauron, and then she goes to this sort of far castle in the north and in the Forodwaith, which is called the Waste. It's this Iceland, and she notices this strange mark, and she knows that Sauron was the one who created it. She has a hunch, but no one believes that Sauron still exists. It's sort of like in the Harry Potter series, the Dark Lord's back, but no one believes him. And I mean, it is true. Galadriel was the one who was in the books raising the alarm a lot more than several of the others. But she's eventually sort of abandoned by her team. They kind of mutiny against her. And so she goes back to Lindon, the capital city of the elves, and the High King Gil-galad, and Elrond is there, who, Elrond, I already discussed this, he looks... He looks like he's right out of high school. They all look so young, which, granted, the elves are all supposed to be young. I don't really understand people's criticism that they don't think the elves are very beautiful in this adaptation. I think, gotta be honest, some of the elven men... Finrod? I'm sold on the short-haired elves, okay? I gotta be honest with you. I'm sold on them. I'm sorry. They look good. They look good. I mean, some of them, I don't know. It varies from one, but the shots of some of the other elves, I'm like, damn, they look hot. They look handsome elves are supposed to be ungodly beautiful. And Arondir, let's not get started on Arondir. He's obviously the most handsome person in this whole show. And actually probably one of the strongest fictional characters that's non-canonical, because all of the other ones that are introduced are a little bit shaky with the writing and interest level. Their motivations and everything. It's just like, you don't care that much. But Galadriel is then sent away to Valinor in what is a very premature sort of, not banishment, it's meant to be a retirement. Because Valinor is obviously where all of the elves are one day going to want to go back. It's just... some of them are wanting to stay behind on Middle-earth because they know that Middle-earth needs some help. The elves are the strongest and most wise and powerful and magical beings that can help Middle-earth, and so some of them stay to look after it. But even in the Second Age, the elves are disappearing. There's so few left by the Third Age, but in the Second Age, there's still not that many. Especially the elves who obviously have been to Valinor before. A lot of these elves the Noldor came over. It was sort of a rebellion. And then there were, of course, all the dark elves that never came, the Mori Quendi, the elves who never came and saw the light of the two trees. They stayed in Middle-earth, and they're mostly the Sylvan elves, the wood elves. Arondir is an example of them. Arondir would have never been to Valinor. Same with Legolas. Legolas is obviously after this time, but you get what I'm saying. So, that being said, Elrond has actually never been to Valinor either. Elrond was born on Middle-earth. Only Galadriel is the only elf shown in this who's actually been to Valinor before. Not even Gil-galad. They were all born on Middle-earth. So, the ironic thing is that Gil-galad is Galadriel's nephew. So like I said, this hierarchy of like superiority when Gilgalad is chastising her, it's like, it shouldn't be the other way around. But Galadriel, of course, this is not canonical at all. Galadriel never, as far as I'm aware, and Tolkien did have different, in Unfinished Tales in the History of Middle Earth, he does have Galadriel, as I mentioned, doing a lot of different things. But Galadriel is never banished. She's never sent to Valinor, and then she decides last minute to jump off the ship and swim, presumably thousands and thousands of leagues back to Middle Earth. I mean, this one parody YouTuber was saying, she must have the power of 1,000 Michael Phelps, because how on earth, I know Galadriel is known to be one of the most powerful beings on Middle Earth at the time, but how on earth is one elven woman going to swim that far? This is before she has the Ring of Power. I mean, it's like, why are you putting her in that position in the first place? Because, I mean, maybe you could have had her abandoned before she got on the ship. I feel like it's more realistic. Maybe she's boarding the ship at the Grey Havens and last minute bails. And then it's more realistic to see how she came to Middle Earth. Now, obviously, we know why they wanted to do this. They wanted her to meet Halbrand on this raft in the middle of the ocean. But she could have met Halbrand somewhere else. But the reason why they want Halbrand and her to be in the middle of the ocean is because they want them to be picked up by a Númenórean ship. They want Elendil to find them. And so Elendil finds them, and we have this sort of budding romance thing going on with Galadriel and Halbrand, which is very cringe. And obviously Halbrand is a fictitious character, or at least at the beginning he appears to be, because Tolkien never wrote such a thing. And they experience Númenor together. And of course, Galadriel, it's not entirely known how much she actually spent time in Númenor. I don't believe she actually ever went to Númenor. The elves did go to Númenor at one point, but even the show gets it correct. By this point in the show, well, by the point that they're supposed to be on the Númenor timeline, because let's keep in mind, the Númenor timeline and the Eregion timelines are meant to be thousands of years apart in the original text. But in this show, they take place at the same time. And then everything that's going on with the Southlands is invented or interpreted from different things that Tolkien wrote. It's interesting, the whole idea of the Southlands. I don't believe the Southlands is a term that Tolkien ever used that descriptively about what Mordor was before it was Mordor. Again, spoilers. Númenor is displayed wonderfully in this show. I mean, oh my God, one of those, just vistas and detailed CGI backdrops that you just want to freeze each frame and look at all of the different bits of architecture. I love how they get right how at that point Númenor is really trying to make its own architectural stamp. The humans, the men who live there, who are the long-lived Númenóreans, they are like an elevated strain of humans. They live longer than humans who live on Earth. They have a little more proximity to the Eldar. They at once were given an elven city, and they were very close with the elves. They show this in the High King, who is now, very bedridden and very old, and cannot rule anymore. So Tarmiriel rules in his place. That they used to be very close and friendly with the elves, but they're turning away from that. They're obviously starting to want to create their own kinds of buildings, their own kinds of culture and architecture. And that is, of course, a seed that's very important to plant for the entire story of the Second Age, because that's going to show their resentment towards the elves. And that is accurate. And we do see that. We have Ar-Pharazôn, who is really the one who wants to be king. And of course, in the books, he actually is the king. It's not Tarmiriel, but they wanted to flip that a little bit, which actually is fine. I don't have a problem with that. Having him more in the shadows actually gives him more motivation to be kind of scheming and conniving. And they do allude to it in the last episode, the sort of longing for immortality when the father, the High King, is about to pass away. These are threads and interesting piecemeal things they need to introduce. They didn't introduce enough, honestly, but I understand it's a 5-season epic. It's going to take their time. There's a lot of dragging their feet with getting through a lot of this, but yeah, so the Númenóreans are going to become more and more distrustful of the elves. They already are. When Galadriel arrives, they treat her like a scarlet letter, and they decide they want to banish her, even though it's very confusing when the episode where she is being banished and she's sailing off, all of a sudden, the white tree starts to lose its blossoms, and that's considered, they say, like, that's a sign from the gods that, the gods are crying. So obviously this is not a good decision. Tarmiriel has decided, wait a minute, maybe Galadriel's meant to be here. Maybe I'm supposed to share my knowledge of what I've seen with her, and maybe I'm supposed to help Middle Earth with her. All of these things. But the way they show the Galadriel not being banished anymore and actually in the High Court with her hood on, like revealed herself to the crowd, I'm like, there's a disconnect. We jumped over something. This was just really unnecessarily confusingly done, because you're thinking, wasn't she just banished? Why? You don't get enough sort of inkling that Tarmiriel has changed her mind before you suddenly see Galadriel reappearing. And it's like, nope, Galadriel's staying. And of course, Halbrand's with her. Of course, Halbrand wants to stay in Numenor. He wants to learn how to be a metalsmith and all of these things. And he's getting into street fights and blah, blah, blah. And of course, Galadriel's trying to figure out who he is, and she discovers all of these, like things about the Southlands from going through old scrolls with Elendil, and then we have, of course, introducing Isildur, who is, of course, these are all prominent figures. I'm going to assume that if you're watching this video, you know all of this stuff, because I'm sorry, this video will be 5,000 hours long. I felt like the whole Isildur Eärien stuff, it's tough, because this is where it's sort of like, understandably, they want to milk these characters. They are important in future parts of the story. But right now, they're not important. They're not important in the kind of interim of this season. But they're forced on us like they are. But I gotta be honest with you, all of the stuff with Eärien and Isildur was just either very confusing, like how he's kicked off of the shipbuilding guild, and the sailing group, because he's distracted and he wants to do it on purpose, and then his friends get mad at him, and then he's suddenly, finding, he wants to go to the Valinor, that's what he really wants to see, and then he suddenly wants to go to Middle Earth. They just don't give him the time to really shine, but at the same time, there's really no space for his character in this season. I really think that the Numenorian stuff will be a lot better sort of dealt with, hopefully, in season 2, now that Galadriel and Halbrand are out of the picture. I feel like all of the Numenorian stuff is really shoehorned and a little bit clunky in the writing department, in the pacing of it, in the way it's kind of arching through the rest of the show and what's going on Middle Earth. Because Galadriel and Halbrand are kind of the only focus, and they're not even really supposed to be there. And then it's like they're stealing the thunder from the characters that we're supposed to get to know, who we don't really feel that much for at this point. They're given the classic, hero father, Elendil, and then his young protege, reckless son, kind of, and then the sister who's taking one for the team and trying her best, even though she's a woman, Like, those archetypes are so clear, but we don't really get much beyond archetypes with those characters. And it's a shame, but it's like also, I don't know, they couldn't take time away from other things, because if anything, they spent way too much time on the Harfoots, for example, than they should have on things that were happening in Eregion with Celebrimbor and the Rings of Power. So, anywho, because that is all brushed over really quickly in episode 8, and it's very unfortunate. So eventually Galadriel gets them all to march on Middle Earth, and they come and they rescue or liberate the Southlands. And that's, of course, a part of the Southlanders story. We've got Bronwyn and her son Theo. They actually are not as... I was expecting them to be my least favorite characters going in. I don't know why. I just didn't get a feeling they were going to be very well fleshed out. They are a little bit one-dimensional. I do think that Theo, the acting is pretty bad. Bronwyn, the actress impressed me. I felt like the Arondir part of her story was more compelling by the end, just because you did kind of want her, for her sake, you wanted her son to be alive, not so much for the son and the mother. There are certain things in that episode, and episode 6 is widely regarded to be the best episode of the series, Udun, because it's just so action-packed compared to the rest of the series, which is pretty slow, with not as much action. I was not sure if Bronwyn and Theo and all these characters were going to survive, because theoretically none of them need to. They're all made-up characters. But they all do. In episode 7, we find out they all do, and it's a little bit like, couldn't at least one of them have died? The only characters that die in the Southlanders kind of story arc are sort of like very, very, very tertiary characters we only barely know, to show that, yeah, some people are dying and people are sad about that. But if Theo or Bronwyn, one of them had died, I was actually kind of thinking Bronwyn because that would have given Theo's character a little bit more weight because I could tell that Theo was going to be a character they wanted to, he's growing up in this transitional period. He's being influenced by dark powers. They have this sort of key scepter thing that turns this mechanism that unleashes all these dams in the Southlands, which is basically the on switch for Mordor. Time to hit the slay button, hit the mortification button. Because the end of episode 6, one of the coolest things that happens, which of course is non-canonical, completely non-canonical, is that this key, sends water through these irrigation canals and underground tunnels into Orodruin, which is shown as this volcano, this dormant volcano, which is Mount Doom. That's the name for it in the Elvish tongue. And it erupts. Now, I don't know the science behind that, but a little bit of water going into a lava pit is not perhaps going to make a volcano erupt like that. I don't know. The science didn't really seem to check out, but anyway, even if it did, the fact that they all survived a pyroclastic cloud coming at them, I mean, that's Transformers Terminator level shit. That's not realistic at all. Not even Galadriel could survive that, especially when she doesn't have the Ring of Power. So apparently, Galadriel doesn't have any supernatural powers before she has Nenya. That's not entirely canonically true. Galadriel, for example, has always had the gift of foresight, and she's always had the ability to peer into others' minds, which is something we see a lot in the Jackson films and we do not see any of in this adaptation, which is obviously them trying to say that the ring is what gives her that power, which that's not how I always interpreted the text. Again, I'm a little rusty on it, forgive me, but correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm a little upset about that. But obviously Galadriel is trained in every style of fighting you can imagine. I mean, she is an excellent, and this is somewhat true. I mean, she probably would have been a very good fighter. But this gets into the ultimate critique, which is that they made Galadriel a cheap female warrior badass instead of being a, slightly more elevated, elegant, regal, divine, powerful, frightening character that she was, a terrifying titan of elvish power. She's very austere still, and she's kind of aloof, but she's just kind of otherwise just a sword-wielding crouching tiger, hidden dragon chick. And it's just not exactly the Galadriel I know or am familiar with. We do get mention of Celeborn, and if for anyone who's wondering, that meme I loved seeing, of tell me, where is Halbrand? For I much desire to speak with him. Yeah, Celeborn, who was supposed to be her actual husband, who they had supposedly already met by this point, he is mentioned. He apparently went off to war, and she never saw him again. Well, we're obviously going to see more of him in later seasons. I think that's been confirmed. So the Halbrand Galadriel potential love thing is obviously over by the end of this season. We know that. Thank goodness. But it was a little scary while watching the show because it's just oh my god, you can't go against the lore like this. Anywho. So we have, okay, I know I'm brushing over a lot of stuff, but I do have to just, of course, briefly summarize the Harfoot storyline, because on top of the storyline that I just illustrated, we have the story of the Harfoots, who are these proto-hobbits. If you've watched my earlier video, I explain how that's not really factually correct based on what Tolkien wrote. Harfoots are not necessarily meant to be proto-hobbits. They are meant to be hobbits that existed at the same time as the other hobbits, maybe a little earlier, but in the Third Age, they were one of the three kinds of hobbits. The Fallowhides, the Stores, and the Harfoots. They're just different, breeds, so to speak, I guess. But no, the Harfoots are sort of these nomadic tribal people who lived thousands of years before the Shire was created, and nobody goes off trail. And look, they're obviously trying to give us a Samwise, Gamgee, a Merry, and Pippin. They're obviously trying to give us some, small little characters who are terrified of the big bad world, but they also know they need to find their courage. And their parents say, well, it's a bad world out there. Don't go out there, and blah, blah, blah. These things work so well in the Lord of the Rings story, but in this one, it just feels so shoehorned. And at the end of the day, it's yeah, I do like that we have a lot of different settings that we're interspersing in. I love the beautiful forests that the Harfoots take place in. I do like the change of, cultures. Of course, they all have Irish accents, just like all the dwarves have Scottish accents. bit typecasted, but whatever. But it's ultimately dragged on for far too long. The Harfoot storyline is just so uninteresting for the most part. But of course, they're the vehicle for this stranger or meteor man who is revealed to be, spoiler alert, one of the wizards. He is not, he's most likely Gandalf. He is not Sauron. We learned that in the final episode. So I understand the decision for them to spend a lot of time with the Harfoots getting to know this character because the wizards, and particularly Gandalf, always had an affinity for hobbits, and this sort of would explain why he spent so much time with them compared to Saruman and the other wizards and the elves who kind of just didn't even know they existed, didn't really care about them very much. I do get that. Because Tolkien kind of left that open-ended, but obviously there's the whole issue of Gandalf arriving way before he's supposed to, and Gandalf was supposed to arrive already as he looked. He wasn't supposed to age. He was supposed to be kind of like this already just old man who was going to be old and present that way for basically forever, from my understanding. So he arrives somewhat younger, and yeah, I don't know. It's like by the end of the series, you just kind of forget that you don't like it as a lore choice. You're just like, whatever. I'm already resigned to it. I'm not going to complain. I'm just going to ride along with it. That's how I felt with a lot of the stuff they did in this series. I was just like, you know what? Just enjoy the show. Don't protest this. Don't get all up in arms because it's only going to raise your blood pressure for whatever. For what? What's the point? Of course, I have to mention the dwarven storyline between Elrond and Durin. They have this, very strong friendship that's tested because of Mithril. And now, of course, the dwarves in Moria mining for Mithril was a storyline that I think is very ripe to show in the Second Age, even though, again, timelines are all over the place. But the introduction of this power, this need for Mithril to sustain the elves so that they do not fade, is completely bogus. And also the origin story of Mithril, the way they describe this battle between someone on the top of the Misty Mountains with a Balrog. Yeah, they're just making shit up. They're just making it up. Whatever. Mithril does have a lot of power. It's very impregnable. It's very, important. And it would have been, for everything, with the Eregion, the ring building stuff, it made sense that, Elrond would be trying to get some of it so that Celebrimbor could make these rings. But I wish they'd made it a little bit more. I know Celebrimbor was being secretive about it, but I wish that had been the premise instead of it being this whole, we needed to revive this tree in Linden, which is kind of representative of our life force. And we have to do it by next spring, by the way, because even though elves, we live for basically forever, and, a century is just like a week to us. Apparently we only got about 6 months on the clock. It's like, what? The urgency of this is so un-elven. They really... No. Probably the least Tolkien thing they ever say in the series is that, and it needs to be done by next spring. It's just like, the elves don't, no. They would have figured this out long before then. It was going to be that soon. Like, I don't know. It just, I don't know. Yeah, I get the relationship they have with Elrond going to Khazad-dûm. Again, come on. They made Khazad-dûm so cool, okay? It is exactly how I always imagined it. And I also really like the character of Disa. She's one of those characters I was really worried about, but honestly, no. She is a really great presence, a back and forth for Durin, reassuring. She's a moment in levity in the show, which we need, which isn't overdone like the Harfoot stuff. Like, seeing the dwarven children running around, I loved that. We needed that. I also love that song that she sings, A Plea to the Rocks, which is sort of this haunting sort of memorial to the dwarves that lost their lives in a cave-in. Or it was also a song to free them so that they can escape a cave-in. I can't remember exactly. It was a little unclear. There were certain times where they jump away from an event. Like, did they survive a cave-in? I'm not entirely sure. They completely jumped past that. Like, in the next cut, they're completely... They jump around and skip things that I think are very important to show, and show us kind of meaningless conversation that, is Tolkien-esque. The dialogue can have all of these platitudes that sound very much like Tolkien in a blender, but at the end of the day, it's saying a lot of nothing. There's a lot of platitudes about hope, and the eye of hope is always open. And all these, it's like they're nice phrases, and I'm sure when you're writing it in the screenplay, you're thinking, "Ooh, oh man, I'm taking Tolkien's prose, and I'm just, oh, this is going to be so poetic and uplifting," and it just didn't come across that way. Most of the lines that were trying so hard, or possibly directly quoting Tolkien, but from a completely different part of his legendarium, like giving a line that was originally spoken by Sam in the Two Towers books and giving it to, Nori's friend or what, I don't remember exactly. I mean, they put lines in all different kinds of places and jumbled it all together, which of course, whatever. I mean, a little bit of that I understand. Like, for example, I don't have a problem with the fact that they used that song, that Tolkien poem to that has that I'm forgetting her name, but Nori's friend sings so wonderfully. Megan Richards is the actress. This Wandering Day. I absolutely loved that sequence. It was beautiful music, beautiful cinematography. It was like the one moment of the Harfoot story I was like, yes, I love this. Anyway, and it's tough because I want to like the Harfoot characters. I think actually Nori is wonderfully played. I think the actress who plays her is phenomenal. And I also actually kind of liked Sadok and Melba and all of them. Like on paper, I was like, they're kind of fun characters and they're very different from everything else in the show. But there's just so much filler fluff that's just okay. It's giving stage musical. It's giving Disney children's afternoon TV. It's completely invented, kind of needless filler. Okay, so I think I've covered the rough synopsis. Obviously, we have the big reveal at the end of episode 8, which is that Halbrand is Sauron. Now, I gotta be honest with you, I did not see that coming at first. I mean, I'd heard the rumors that it was possible, and I was like, there's no way. I didn't think the writers were that smart, to be honest with you. But it kind of caught me by surprise. I was like, oh, okay. Look, I will admit, if that's the route they were always going to go, it kind of makes sense the way they did things looking back. The whole Galadriel and Halbrand Sauron thing, the way how close they were at one point, it almost kind of makes sense for how Galadriel is so motivated and betrayed and angry going forward about defeating Sauron. It does make sense. And I think a lot of people were kind of critiquing. I actually think that, again, the scene where Sauron gets in her head as he's revealing himself as Halbrand, where he is tempting her to be his queen, I think that's a wonderfully done scene, because it's true that, at the time, in the Second Age, Sauron was trying to be rehabilitated. He went through a lot of phases where he really did. He always wanted power, but he wasn't necessarily wanting to be evil. He was very wayward, and he definitely mourned the loss of, his master Morgoth and the power that he had at that time. But as my understanding of it, he was perhaps rehabilitated or trying to be, and showing him as Halbrand like that was sort of a. Now it's an interesting, and then him asking Galadriel to be his wife, and then sort of making this promise, which, we all know he wouldn't have kept because he wants power above all else. But him saying, you hold me to the good, I hold you to power, I think was a really wonderful kind of metaphorical sort of what if for Galadriel, because Galadriel could have turned dark at many of these different junctures. And we see that in the Fellowship of the Ring when she rejects the One Ring from Frodo, but she's very tempted. And other instances where Galadriel could have been one of the most, she could have been, on Sauron's level, even though she's not a Maiar. Sauron is a Maiar. He's basically like an angel, whereas, Galadriel's only an Eldar. She's a very powerful Eldar, and very old. She is not quite on that level. But yeah, so I don't know. I actually kind of liked the way that was done. And then, of course, he gets very incel-y at the end. I was like, how dare you reject me? Okay, I'm going to kill everyone now. I mean, it's kind of, what are you going to do? Sort of like a Joker prototype story. But I love how she gets into her head and pretends to be Finrod and basically uses Finrod's voice to tell Galadriel that she needs to help Celebrimbor with building the Rings of Power. That's something that I think was wonderfully woven into the idea of the lore of the deception that was going on, that Sauron was deceiving Celebrimbor and these elves in Eregion, the elven smith capital place we see. I know it's very confusing. You might think it's Lindon as well, but they're actually in two different regions. This is a lot closer to the Misty Mountains and sort of where Rivendell was. The Lindon is like far coast, kind of by the Grey Havens. So distance. But because I wish we had shown more was Celebrimbor being, influenced more nefariously and deceived by Halbrand Sauron. I wish we had gotten another episode in the middle of episode 7 and 8 that showed after Halbrand was taken to Eregion to be healed. He the way they rush through that entire sequence, it's just like he's suddenly up and he's interested and he's talking to Celebrimbor about things that Celebrimbor really should know. Even though two minds can be better than one, about crafting what's supposed to be at one point just one crown, which then turns into two crowns, and then Galadriel says, "Let's make three." All of this sort of inference about why they make 3 rings instead of crowns and why there's 3 instead of 2, none of that's in the books. The way it's written in the books, from my understanding, is they first make 9 rings for mortal men. Then they make the 7 rings, cue the Ariana Grande song, for the dwarves and the dwarf lords. And then lastly, they make the 3 rings for the elves. The elven rings are made last, not first, as is inferred in this story, unless we completely jumped over the part where they also made 15 other rings for the humans and the dwarves. And then Sauron goes and makes the Master Ring in Mount Doom that none of the elven smiths know about. That's the sort of long con of it all, right? And we do get hints of that because we see at the last shot Halbrand going to Mount Doom, and after being rejected and, of course, revealed to be who he is by Galadriel. And we also learn that Elrond kind of figures it out by the end, too. Not Celebrimbor, not Gilgalad. They don't figure it out at the end. But also, how are they still working in that smith when Gilgalad, in that metalworking shop, when Gilgalad tells them that they have to leave? And, is there any consequence for that? Gilgalad leaves and they're all supposed to leave and shut it down and they just keep working. Sort of like, okay, the High King told us to do this, but we're just going to disobey him. Whatever. That's sort of a strange kind of thing they don't really address. But anyway. And so, yeah, eventually they make the 3 rings, Narya, Vilya, and Nenya. And Nenya is, of course, Galadriel's ring. Narya goes to, I believe, Elrond. I can't remember who gets which ring, but it's interesting because Celebrimbor ends up getting killed by Sauron. We're going to probably see that in season 2 or 3. And so the ring of Celebrimbor gets passed to Círdan, who is not introduced in this season, but he is another elf, high elf. He's a shipwright. He works in the Grey Havens. He lives in the Grey Havens. He's the one who ends up getting that ring. I think it's Vilya that he ends up having. And Narya stays with Elrond. But then Elrond eventually gives it to Gandalf. So in the Third Age. Yeah, so that's how Gandalf gets it. And then Galadriel's the only one to keep her ring the entire time, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, that's where we're at. Overall, look, there's a lot, I think, of prelude and prologue in this season that actually might be setting up for a more interesting season 2. I legit have a lot of faith that maybe they're looking at, I know the writers have addressed that they know that the pacing and some of the writing, because let's be honest, the worst part about the show is the writing. They know that some of the writing and pacing is bad in this first season, that they spent a little too long on certain things and not enough time on others. If they've learned that lesson, they obviously also have time to maybe course correct some lore things, though some of it's kind of hard for them to undo. If we see in the second season, the rings of power made for men and for the dwarves, and of course the creation of the One Ring, and we get, Halbrand continuing to deceive Celebrimbor as Sauron, though in a different form, perhaps. I'm not entirely sure if the actor who played Halbrand is going to be coming. I think he is, but it might just be in flashbacks, because apparently we're going to be getting Halbrand's origin story, which of course is Sauron's origin story. Well, how did he get on that raft in the first place? Because of course Sauron has been alive since the beginning of time. He says that in that line. Sauron is ultimately the oldest character in this entire show. It's just like Morgoth. They were created basically in the first day, in the Genesis day one. They were, the Valar were created first, then the Mire. Okay, boy, I'm going a mile a minute here. There's some really sloppy writing. There's some really cringy things they do. Like, why did we need to see the Southlands text and then Mordor? It's like pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious. In the end of episode 6, did not understand that. There's obviously, the mystics that were introduced. I believe that the mystics are supposedly human beings who are corrupted by dark powers, unseen world powers in Rune, the Far East. They were also perhaps in Sauron's experiments that he was doing in the Far North. They were a part of that. So I believe that they were humans who basically sold their soul and became evil spirits, sort of like ring wraiths before the ring wraiths existed, because they do look very Nazgul-like, even though they can't be the Nazgul in the form that the Nazgul we understand them are, because the Nazgul were corrupted by the rings of power. So they were sort of the prototypes, I guess. But it did make sense if someone like Gandalf were to arrive on Middle Earth, they might think, because Gandalf is a Mire just like Sauron. So Gandalf could have been Sauron. But then he says, "I am good." And it's like, that's the line you have to say. Like, this is Oscar level screenplay here. I am good. I don't know. It's a little on the nose, but they realize he's not Sauron, and that's of course a big reveal. He's probably Gandalf, though of course he could be one of the Blue Wizards. I hope he's one of the Blue Wizards. But that line where he says, always follow your nose, it's like that must be Gandalf, because it's just too on the nose. There's a lot of things with distance and time not really being expressed correctly. I feel like the Númenóreans arrive in the Southlands very quickly. Obviously, yeah, they're going to skip a lot of that journey, but they make it seem like it's just nothing. And it's like, this is a vast amount of distance that they're having to cover. But then again, Galadriel can swim in an afternoon, basically, from Valinor, which is supposed to be on the far ends of the ocean, all the way across the giant, the sundering seas. Technically, she doesn't swim the whole sea. She does get picked up, but it's I don't know. I don't know where that raft is. Maybe that raft is pretty far out. It's not near the coast, because it's a little ridiculous. It has to be pretty close to where she bailed ship, because otherwise, it's not even elvenly possible that she'd survive swimming that long. My favorite thing about the show, besides the visuals, I do have to give credit to the score. Bear McCreary. When I first heard the soundtrack album, which actually came out like the day after I put out the video, I didn't realize it was coming out so quickly. The first video I ever made for this, it took me a while to get into it, but I'm actually kind of addicted to the motifs and themes for all of these different characters and cultures. His score is starting to live up to the Howard Shore one, and that's a tall order here. I still think there's ultimately a little bit more extra something to the Howard Shore scores from the first trilogy. But, I'm definitely liking this more than the Hobbit soundtrack, that's for sure. Even though, of course, there's no of those nostalgic themes. It's all new themes. But the new themes I'm pretty on board with. So I have to give credit. I mean, I do think maybe the show is a little overscored. There's very little moment where there's not music in the background. And I do think possibly the music is sort of overdoing the cheese factor a little bit sometimes, with the overdramatic music all the time. But that's, it's a nitpicking thing for me. I do think the music mostly does what it needs to do. I mean, there's moments where, obviously, like I said, there's some breathtaking vocal performances. Like I said, Sophia Nomvet doing that Plea to the Rocks. Oh, best part of the soundtrack for sure. Can we talk about Fiona Apple being in the end credits singing Where the Shadows Lie, which is basically the Run Ring poem, which is, a classic poem from Tolkien about the creation of the Rings of Power. I was like, Fiona Apple is singing this. I love that they're continuing the tradition of having these sort of seasoned sort of new age alternative artists like Enya, Annie Lennox, who was supposed to be Björk in Two Towers, but Emiliana Torini, and Neil Finn and others. They're keeping up the sort of legacy of that with Fiona, and I love the end credits song. It's perhaps my favorite part of the whole series. It's just so haunting. Yes, it does sound a little bit melodically like Gollum's song, but it's a different melody. No copyright infringement here. And I think it needs to be, because it's this ominous, sort of dreadful, kind of sad story about the creation of the One Ring and the reveal of evil, and what's to come in the remainder of the show. And it's just a perfect sort of way to end things. So they do some things right on the show. I gotta be real with you. I think that last shot also of Halbrand kind of going into Mordor, that's exactly how I would have ended the series too. Because revealing it as sort of like this last minute gotcha moment where he's also been banished, his cover's blown, and he has to go. It's just, I would have had all of the rings already be made by that point, because that makes more sense. Now, of course, Sauron is also going to be infiltrating Numenor. Now, he's already been there as Halbrand, but obviously he's going to come back as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He comes to Numenor as this beautiful figure and deceives them with all of these things and treasures, and promises them that if they go to war with the elves, they are going to usurp them and get Valinor, and they're going to become immortal, and promises all these lies, which basically creates the fall of Numenor, which we see predicted in that dream or prophecy of Tar Miriel in that one scene, which I actually think is a great thing to interject into it, because it was a jarring kind of like, oh, this is what's to come. Like, it adds some depth to the Numenor storyline of season 1, even though it's not addressed that much in the first season. But there's a lot of groundwork that's being laid. I think season 2 will be a lot more interesting with Ar-Pharazôn going against Tar Miriel, who's now blind, as a sort of gotcha. You shouldn't have gone to Middle-earth. Look, you became blind. I mean, your father basically said all that awaits you there is darkness. Why did you listen to him? So it's kind of like, what was the point of this? Middle-earth, we need to be looking west. We need to be, fighting the elves. We need to be staking more power. We need to claim what's ours and not forget the people of Middle-earth. We don't need them. And forget the elves, too. You should never have brought Galadriel here, I think that it'll pick up. And then Anatar will come in and be this new iteration of Sauron that they're not familiar with. Because, of course, they'd recognize Halbrand. So Halbrand can't be back in Numenor. So we've got all of that to look forward to. I don't know. I mean, look, I know that people are going to be like, after watching this season, like, I don't want any more of this. But I genuinely want to believe that this show could only get better. It can't get worse, right? I mean, they're going to have the same scores, then hopefully the same budget and costumes and cinematography. And if they've learned a little bit from the writing, and maybe even in future seasons, they'll have more fan sort of responses to sift through for season 3, at least. They'll know what we're saying, because they did move into season 2 rather quickly. So they didn't really get a lot of time to factor in fan response, which is unfortunate, but it's going to take them a long time to make it anyway. Like we said, it's going to be 2024, God knows when in that year. So could be 2 years before we get the next season. So yeah, I don't know. And obviously Nori and the stranger, who is Gandalf, are going to be going off on an adventure together to Rune. So we're going to get to see that storyline, which, okay. I mean, again, I'm trying to just take it and be like, I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to get mad and harp on about how this character shouldn't even be there and this shouldn't be there and this shouldn't. It's just like, what's the point? There's so many channels that are doing that, and they're just ripping this show to shreds. And I'm sitting here like, you know what? Hey, the first time I watched all of these episodes, especially when I didn't read anything about them beforehand, I enjoyed myself and even was blown away and transported by several scenes. And I need that right now. Mass media, especially corporate franchise fantasy shows, have been really disappointing us lately. And I want a show that, I don't know, I want this to be good. And of course, it's not that great. But is it the worst thing? I mean, people are talking about plot holes. I'm like, I cannot think of a single show I've ever watched that doesn't have plot holes. Come on, there's always going to be something. I don't know. People are being really, really unfair on this show. And it's just and then I already have talked about, if people are angry, I spent a lot of time talking about, people call it woke of the rings and all the fact the forced diversity. It's like, get out of here. Because honestly, that is the least of my issues with the show, especially after now seeing season 1. All of the characters, they may not feel like Tolkien, but it has nothing to do with their skin color, okay? Arendir, ironically, might be the most Tolkien-esque figure, and I heard this talked about on the Men of the West YouTube channel, so forgive me for sort of copying them a little bit here, but I do want to just parrot this. Arendir, who is, a black elf, and he's a fictional character, is probably the most Tolkien-esque character in the whole, convented characters canon that they've made, because I don't know, just his delivery and his bravery, his heroism, that's not sort of holier than thou, and it's just very Aragorn-esque, but without, I don't know. It's just his character's endearing. I don't know what else to say. You really feel the emotion on his face when he is, seeing his elven brethren getting tortured in that pit. You really feel like the sort of, I don't know, the passion that he has to protect these people. Stay behind, when the rest of his kin are saying, abandon these lands. These people sided with Morgoth in the Great War. Why do we want to be a part of them? It's I think his character is one of the stronger ones. It's stronger than Bronwyn and Theo, that's for sure. Though they need to, of course, give him a love interest. And, I do get why they kept Bronwyn alive, but I would have liked to have seen Bronwyn get killed off. She almost dies. And I was like, oh my God, that would make this show really emotional. And then we'd get Theo mourning his mother, and Theo would have so much more baggage on him because he already feels guilty for causing all of this, because he was the one who found the shaft in the first place. But then, of course, it was stolen. From him. It was a sort of trickery thing because Halbrand was deceiving everyone. Now, there is a theory, I'm going to end with this. There is a theory being floated around that Halbrand was not Sauron the whole time, but that he only became Sauron when he was sort of resurrected in Eregion from being, wounded almost mortally in that battle. But I don't think that necessarily flies, because all of the motivations he says, he talks about finding Galadriel, and yeah, I don't know. And I think he's Sauron from the beginning, because the way he is in Numenor, it sort of makes sense. Like, he's toying with her. And he's sus. He's just a bit sus with everything. So I kind of don't buy that. But anyway, I also don't think the writers are that inventive. But anyway, yeah, I don't know. The only real big death we get is Sadok. And Rip Sadok, he kind of dies unceremoniously. You don't really feel that much for him, though. Because all the Harfoots, Nori's the only one that you'd really mourn at this point. But that long goodbye was just so overdone. Oh my God. These are things people have griped on about. Look, I got to wrap this up. So this is getting very long. But I want to have hope, okay? Like I said in the first video, I don't know if we're going to be getting other Lord of the Rings adaptations in any time, possibly in my lifetime. We are going to be getting this animated War of the Rohirrim film in 2023, I believe, next year. Maybe 2024. Not sure. It might be 2 years from now. And here we have the CEO of Warner Brothers saying that he wants to do more Lord of the Rings stuff. So maybe we will get more stuff from material that's not, that's been sold by the estate. More Third Age stuff, mostly. Maybe it'll be done well, but I don't know. If this is all we're going to get, I need to sort of just sit and eat my food, because I don't know, spending time just bashing it, focusing only on the negatives, attacking people who enjoy the show. In this economy, look at our mental health, okay? We all need an escape. This show, at the end of the day, had some beautiful scenes, beautiful music, some transportative imagery, and, it wasn't that bad. It was just not as good as it could have been, and that makes it really bad because of the expectations, and I get it. And we all know the lore is just, this is fanfic. It is really disappointing. You've probably heard the news about The Witcher as well. Henry Cavill's leaving because the writers don't care about the source material. Apparently, the writers do care about the Rings of Power source material, but they don't act like they do. It's just like, why is anyone taking on these IPs and they don't actually like the books that they're taking it from? They're just like hell bent on destroying these things. Wheel of Time. I don't understand. I don't understand. It's really depressing. I'm really worried about this Merlin series that's in development with Disney Plus. If anyone's familiar with the T.A. Barron novels, I've been wanting an adaptation made of those Merlin books for so long, and apparently it's happening. But I'm not getting my hopes up because it's Disney, and you know how things go over there. So, yeah, I mean, right at the end of the day, Jeff Bezos is Sauron. Like, I'm sorry. You know, these CEOs, David Zaslav is Sauron, Elon Musk is Sauron. All right. Well, I got to wrap this up. Let me know what your thoughts were on this show. What did you enjoy about it? What would you have changed? Obviously, I think we all agree on a lot of the things we would have changed about it, but let's focus more on the positives. No, I totally get if you want to harp on the negatives, but I hope that you found this interesting. And if you were on the fence about the show, I'm sorry if I spoiled some things. You probably already read about it. Look, if you're on the fence and this made you want to watch it, you know, go ahead. Don't feel bad. I mean, especially if you already have the Amazon Prime account, you're going to see some breathtaking visuals. I mean, seeing Khazad-dûm in real life in its glory is just, and Numenor, it's worth it. It's worth it, okay? If you have any kind of interest in the lore, I know there's so much that's dubious, but I do think that in itself is still, I don't know. I'm choosing to look at the positive. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you all have a wonderful, blessed day. Thank you all so much for watching. Please give this a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you are new here. And I will see you all in my next video. Peace, love, and light. Bye.